The day Nora Callahan walked into Harrow Cross Medical Center in Portland, Oregon, carrying a battered canvas bag and a resume that looked almost embarrassingly plain, every senior staff member on that floor made the same mistake. They looked at her and saw nothing. A woman in her mid-40s, quiet eyes, worn shoes, no prestigious fellowship, no published papers, no name anyone recognized. What they didn't see, what they couldn't see, was the 18 years she'd spent keeping soldiers alive in places that didn't appear on any map. By nightfall, that mistake would cost them everything. Before we go any further, if you're the kind of person who loves stories about quiet strength, about the people everyone underestimates proving every single person wrong, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this channel so you don't miss what's coming next. And when you're done watching, drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's get into it. The elevator doors opened onto the third floor of Harrow Cross Medical Center at 7:42 in the morning, and Nora Callahan stepped out alone. She had a canvas bag slung over one shoulder, dark green, military surplus, the kind of bag that had been repaired twice along one seam, and showed it. Her navy scrubs were clean but not new. Her hair was pulled back without ceremony. She didn't look around the way new employees usually didn't pause to absorb the size of the place, or the noise, or the organized confusion of a level 2 trauma center beginning its morning cycle. She just looked at the directional signs on the wall, found the one that said Nursing Administration, and walked toward it. The hallway smelled like floor cleaner and recycled air. Gurneys lined one wall. Somewhere behind a curtained bay, a monitor beeped in an irregular pattern that technically wasn't alarming, but was the kind of sound an experienced person noticed anyway. Nora noticed it. She kept walking. The nursing station at the end of the hall was staffed by 3 people, 2 of them mid-conversation about a scheduling conflict and one of them on the phone. None of them looked up when she arrived. She stood at the counter and waited, which was what you did. And after about 40 seconds, the youngest of the 3, a man named Derek with a laminated badge clipped to his breast pocket, glanced over. "Help you?" Nora Callahan. "Starting today. Emergency department, floor nursing." He looked at his computer screen, clicked something, looked back at her. "You got here early." "By 12 minutes, she said. He seemed mildly surprised by that. Most new hires showed up at 8 on the dot or a few minutes after, slightly breathless, wearing the expression of someone who'd been rehearsing their first impression in the car. She hadn't done that. She didn't seem particularly nervous. She didn't seem particularly anything. "Okay," Derek said, and reached for a lanyard. "I'll get someone to walk you through orientation." The someone turned out to be a nurse named Bev Okafor, who had been at Harrow Cross for 11 years and carried herself with the particular authority of a person who had survived multiple hospital administrations and no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. She was warm but efficient. She shook Nora's hand, looked at the canvas bag, and said, "Is that your kit?" "That's my bag," Nora said. "We have supply lockers. Standardized kits are issued on the floor." "I know. I'll use the locker." Bev studied her for a moment, the kind of look that was less about judgment than calibration, and then nodded and started walking. She pointed out the medication room, the trauma bays, the supply closets, the break room. She talked about the shift structure, the attendings currently on rotation, the unwritten rules that mattered more than the written ones. Nora listened and asked 2 questions, both specific, both the kind a person asks only if they already understand the context well enough to know what they don't know yet. By the time the orientation loop was done, Bev was looking at her a little differently. Not impressed exactly, something more careful than that. "You've done emergency work before," Bev said. It wasn't a question. "Some," Nora said. She didn't elaborate and Bev didn't push. That was its own kind of language, and Bev was fluent in it. The trouble started before lunch. It started specifically with Dr. Cole Hargrove. Hargrove was the chief of emergency medicine at Harrow Cross. 49 years old, Stanford trained, the kind of doctor who had photographs of himself shaking hands with hospital board members on the wall behind his office desk. He was good at his job in the way that men who've been told they're exceptional for long enough eventually become. not through natural excellence, but through the accumulated confidence of never having been seriously challenged. He moved through the emergency department like he was the weather, present, unavoidable, and operating under the assumption that everything would reorganize itself around him. He noticed Nora mid-morning when she was finishing an intake assessment on a chest pain patient in Bay 4. He didn't say anything then. He just paused in the hallway, looked through the glass partition, and watched her work for a few seconds with the particular expression of someone who has already decided what they're looking at and is simply confirming it. Later, in the corridor outside the nursing station, he said it out loud, not to Nora, but to the two residents flanking him, and not quietly enough. Harrington finally processed the fall hires. A pause. That one looks like she wandered in from a walk-in clinic. One of the residents laughed. The other looked uncertain. Hargrove had already moved on. Nora was 2 feet around the corner, updating a chart on a mobile terminal. She heard it. She finished updating the chart. The thing about spending 18 years in environments where contempt could get people killed was that you stopped reacting to it when the stakes were low. Contempt in a hospital hallway was not a threat. It was noise. She had learned a long time ago to let noise pass through her, the way wind passes through a wire fence. It registers, it stings a little, and then it's gone. What was harder to let pass was what she found in the supply closet at 11:15. She'd been sent to pull 2 trauma kits for a pair of incoming MVA patients. Standard request, nothing unusual. But the third shelf, where the hemorrhage control kits were supposed to be stocked, had 4 boxes where there should have been 22. She checked the adjacent shelf, checked the secondary closet across the hall, checked the log mounted inside the door. The log said 22. The shelf said 4. That gap wasn't a counting error. That wasn't a delivery delay. That was a discrepancy between recorded inventory and actual inventory, and in a trauma setting, that kind of discrepancy had a name. It was called a safety violation. She pulled the 4 available kits, brought them to the incoming patients, and then wrote up an incident report. Clear, factual, specific. She filed it through the hospital's internal reporting system at 11:43. She noted the shelf location, the log count, the actual count, the date, and the time. Then she went back to work. At 2 in the afternoon, she was pulled aside by a charge nurse named Sandra Vale. Sandra had been at Harrow Cross for 6 years. She was competent, visibly overworked, and wore the expression of someone perpetually managing a problem she hadn't created. She closed the door to the small consultation room and said, "You filed an incident report this morning. Supply discrepancy in closet C," Nora said. "Trauma kits." "I know what it was." Sandra folded her arms, not aggressively, but the way you fold your arms when you're bracing for something. Here's the thing. Supply audits are handled by materials management. Filing through the incident system routes it to administration, which means it goes on record, which means it creates paperwork for everyone. "It's a safety issue," Nora said. "Everything here is a safety issue." Sandra exhaled. "I'm not saying you were wrong to notice it. I'm saying you went around the process. I followed the reporting protocol in the employee handbook." Sandra was quiet for a second. "Hargrove's going to want to talk to you." "Okay." "He's not going to be happy." "Okay," Nora said again, in the same tone, and Sandra looked at her with something that might have been respect, or might have been pity, or might have been both at once. Hargrove didn't want to talk to her until 4:15, which Nora suspected was deliberate, the kind of scheduling choice that was designed to let a person sit with their anxiety for a few hours. She spent those hours doing her job, which was the only response she knew that made sense. When she finally sat down across from him in his office, he didn't offer her coffee. He didn't make small talk. He picked up a printed copy of her incident report, held it without looking at it, and said, "You've been here one day." "Yes." "And in one day, you filed a report that's now being processed by hospital administration, materials management, and, because of how the system routed it, compliance." "That's how the system works," she said. "I know how the system works." His voice had the flat precision of someone who was angry but had decided to manage it. "What I don't know is why a new hire, on her first shift, decided that the appropriate response to a minor supply count discrepancy was to trigger a compliance flag. Because the count was off by 18 units in a trauma supply closet. Nora kept her voice level. That's not minor. It's an inventory glitch. If it's a glitch, the audit will confirm that. He set the paper down. You want to tell me about your background? It's in my file. Your file says you were an LPN at a veterans outpatient clinic in Boise for 2 years before this. Before that, it's vague. He leaned back slightly. Vague backgrounds don't inspire confidence. I can give you a full employment history if that would help. What would help, he said carefully, is if the newest member of this department understood that institutional processes exist for reasons, and that overriding those processes on day one creates friction that affects everyone. I didn't override anything, she said. I used the reporting system. The look he gave her then was not quite anger. It was something more considered than that. The look of a man making a calculation. Get back to your shift, he said. We'll revisit this at the end of the week. She stood. She didn't thank him. But that evening, during the overlap between the day and evening shifts, Bev Okafor found Nora in the break room refilling her water bottle. How'd it go with Hargrove? Fine, Nora said. Bev sat down at the small table and wrapped both hands around a coffee mug. You know he's going to make it not fine. Nora looked at her. He does this, Bev said. Somebody new comes in, somebody competent, and they notice something, and if noticing it is inconvenient, he finds a reason. She paused. Last year there was a tech named Martin Ruiz, filed a report about medication logging inconsistencies. 2 weeks later he was gone, position eliminated. Hargrove said it was a budget decision. And was it? Does it matter? Bev looked into her coffee. I'm not trying to scare you, I'm telling you so you know what you're dealing with. Nora considered this. Then she said, What do you know about the trauma kit discrepancy? Bev was quiet for a moment too long. Bev? It's not the first time, Bev said quietly. There have been shortfalls in the trauma supplies for months. Materials management keeps logging the correct numbers because someone upstream is telling them to. I don't know who. I don't know why. She looked up. I do know that 2 patients in February waited longer than they should have for hemorrhage control because of it. Were those delays reported? Not officially. Nora set her water bottle down. What about the trauma reports from those cases? Bev shook her head slightly. I pulled them once. The timeline in the documentation didn't match what I remembered from that shift. But documentation's documentation. If you challenge it, you need proof. Nora didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, somewhere in the department, a radio crackled with an incoming alert. Both women automatically tracked the sound, identifying it, measuring it, the way people who have worked in emergency medicine long enough learn to do without thinking. You should be careful, Bev said. I know, Nora said. I mean it. Not everyone here is going to be glad you're asking questions. I know that too. The next morning, the second discrepancy was worse. Nora arrived at 6:50, 30 minutes before her shift started, which was a habit from years in environments where 30 minutes was the difference between ready and not ready. She was reviewing handoff notes from the overnight shift when she noticed something in the medication administration log for Bay 7. A patient had been given a dosage of anticoagulant therapy that was notated as standard protocol, but the patient's chart flagged a known contraindication, a clotting disorder in the documented history that made that dosage not just aggressive but dangerous. The notation in the chart suggested the contraindication had been reviewed, but the flag was still active, unresolved, sitting in the system like a sentence that had been started and abandoned. She cross-checked the timestamp. The contraindication flag had been active for 6 hours before the medication was administered. Someone had known, or someone had chosen not to look. The patient had been discharged 2 hours ago, apparently without incident, which was either a medical near miss or pure luck, and she had learned long ago that luck was not a clinical protocol. She documented what she found. She flagged the chart. She sent it through the system, same process as the day before, because that was what the system was for. By 9 o'clock, Sandra Vale was at her elbow again, this time without the conciliatory tone. You filed another report. Yes. Hargrove is... I know. Sandra stepped closer and lowered her voice. Nora, listen to me. 2 reports in 2 days, both flagging things that are going to be difficult to investigate without implicating staff that have been here for years. Do you understand what that means for you? It means someone needs to look at the records. It means you're going to be the problem. Sandra's voice was tired, not unkind. They're going to make you the problem, because it's easier than looking at the records. Nora looked at her steadily. If they make me the problem, then there's documentation of 2 incidents filed through the official system before they did it. That's not nothing. Sandra stared at her. Then she said quietly, "Where were you before the clinic in Boise?" Nora picked up her clipboard. "On my shift," she said, and walked back to the floor. Hargrove moved faster than she expected. She got the email at 10:53 on her second day. It was from hospital administration, copied to Hargrove, and it informed her that her employment at Harrow Cross Medical Center was being terminated effective immediately, citing her probationary period, inadequate fit with departmental culture, and a pattern of disrupting established workflow. There was a standardized paragraph about final paycheck processing and badge return. She read it once, closed the email, finished the documentation she was working on because the patient didn't become less of a patient because she'd just been fired. Then she walked to the supply locker, retrieved her canvas bag, and moved toward the exit. The floor was busy around her, people passing, moving, doing what they did. A couple of nurses saw her with the bag and understood immediately. You recognized the look of someone carrying their things out, and looked away, not cruelly, the way people look away from things they don't want to be part of. One of the orderlies, a young man named Theo, who had been quietly helpful on her first day, stopped her near the elevator. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm fine." "That's fast," he said, "even for probationary." "Yes," she said. "It is." He looked like he wanted to say something else, but the elevator arrived and she stepped in, and the doors closed between them. She stood in the elevator going down, canvas bag over her shoulder, and thought about the medication log and the supply shortfall, and Bev's voice saying 2 patients waited longer than they should have, and the falsified documentation she now couldn't prove was falsified because she no longer had access to the system. She thought about the 18 years before the clinic in Boise. She thought about a hillside in a country she didn't name in job applications. She thought about what it meant to walk away from something when walking away was the wrong call. The elevator opened onto the lobby. She walked out into the Portland morning, which was gray and cool and smelled like rain that hadn't arrived yet. She stood on the sidewalk outside the main entrance and took a breath. Then the radio on the security post near the ambulance bay crackled with something urgent, and she stopped. She heard the words, "Multi-vehicle incident, Highway 26 westbound, military transport convoy, multiple casualties en route." She stayed on the sidewalk. She didn't move. The first ambulance turned into the bay 40 seconds later, lights going. Then another. The radio crackled again with a count. The dispatcher's voice giving numbers that were not small. The kind of numbers that meant a department already running on shorted supplies and altered documentation was about to be tested in a way it was not equipped to handle. She stood there with her hand on the strap of her canvas bag and watched the second ambulance pull in, and the third, and she could hear the controlled chaos starting inside the building because the bay doors were open and sound traveled, and she knew what that sound meant because she had heard a version of it in places most of these people had never been and would never go. The fourth ambulance came in. A medic jumped from the back, and then she heard it. A voice she almost recognized, ragged with pain, coming through the open bay doors. Not the words, just the cadence, the specific rhythm of someone trying to stay conscious and failing at the edges, the way soldiers sounded when they were fighting both an injury and the training that told them to stay in the fight. Her feet moved before she decided to move them. She was back through the bay doors, canvas bag still over her shoulder, walking toward the sound, when the medic from the 4th unit turned around and saw her face and stopped dead. He was young, 26, maybe 27. She didn't recognize him, but he recognized her, and the look on his face was the look of someone who has just seen something that shouldn't be possible. "Ma'am," he said, and then corrected himself, voice dropping. "Commander." The word landed in the ambulance bay like something dropped from a height. Around them, the chaos continued. Gurneys moving, voices calling out numbers and assessments. The controlled flood of a mass casualty event beginning to fill a hospital that was not ready for it. But in the space between her and this medic, for just a second, everything went very still. She looked at him. "How many?" 14 critical, he said without hesitation, the way you answer a commander. 6 of them ours. The convoy hit a jackknife semi on the westbound slope. 3 vehicles. What's your assessment of the receiving setup? She was already looking past him into the bay, reading what she could see. He hesitated. It's not... He stopped. "Ma'am, it's not set up right. Triage is going to the wrong zones. I heard them say trauma kit availability was..." "I know," she said. Inside, she heard someone shout about a missing airway kit. She heard another voice call out a blood pressure number that was wrong in a way that required a decision in the next 90 seconds, not the next 9 minutes. She shifted the canvas bag on her shoulder. She pulled her terminated employee badge out of her pocket and looked at it for 1 second, then set it on the edge of the nearest gurney. Then she walked through the bay doors and back into Harrow Cross Medical Center. And her voice, when she spoke, carried in the way that voices carry when they have been trained to cut through noise that would stop other people cold. "Who's running triage?" Heads turned. "I said, who is running triage? Answer me." A resident named Pollard raised his hand. He was 28, maybe, with the look of someone who had been placed in charge of something slightly too large for him, and knew it. "I am," he said. "Dr. Pollard, I'm the senior—" "You've got critical patients going to Bay 3 and 4, Nora said, already moving. "Bay 3 has a compromised oxygen line. It's been tagged for maintenance since yesterday. Who cleared it?" Pollard blinked. I wasn't told. Get your critical airways into Bay 6 and 7, now." She was at the triage board, reading it the way you read a situation report, fast and without sentiment. "Who assessed the abdominal trauma in the 2nd unit?" A paramedic to her left said, "I did. Blunt force, BP's dropping. We've got him on. He needs a surgeon in the next 8 minutes, not the next 20. Where's your OR liaison?" Nobody answered that immediately, which told her what she needed to know about how the intake had been organized. Behind her, she heard footsteps, fast, purposeful, the kind that meant authority. She turned and found Hargrove coming through the interior doors from the main department, his face carrying the compressed fury of a man who had just been told something he didn't want to hear. He stopped when he saw her. "You were terminated," he said. "I know. You need to leave this facility. You have 14 critical casualties incoming from a military convoy accident. Your primary trauma bays have supply and equipment deficiencies that I documented yesterday, and your triage is misrouted." She held his gaze. "You can call security after." His jaw tightened. Around them, the bay was filling. Another ambulance had backed in, doors swinging, a gurney coming fast with 2 medics running alongside it calling out vitals. Hargrove looked at the incoming patient. He looked at the triage board. He looked at Pollard, who gave him nothing useful because Pollard was 28 years old and overwhelmed and honest enough not to pretend otherwise. Hargrove looked back at Nora. "You're not authorized. Call it a civilian assist," she said. "Deal with the paperwork later." She didn't wait for his answer. She moved to the incoming gurney, assessed the patient in 4 seconds. Male, mid-30s, uniform, right leg tourniquet applied in the field. That was correct, but his breathing pattern was wrong in a specific way, and said to the medic beside her, "Tension pneumo, left side. Has anyone decompressed?" "No, we were focused on the leg. Get me a 14 gauge, now." The medic moved. Nora set her canvas bag on the floor beside the gurney, unzipped the top section, and pulled on gloves from the interior pocket while the medic scrambled for the needle. Bev Okafor appeared at her shoulder, not asking questions, just present, because Bev had 11 years in this department and she read a situation as well as anyone. "Bag's open," Bev said quietly. "What do you need?" "Hold this position," Nora said, and Bev's hands came in without hesitation and held exactly what needed holding. And between the two of them, they managed the decompression in the window it needed to happen in, and the patient's breathing shifted. Not perfectly, not cinematically, but measurably. the way bodies respond to the right intervention when it's applied in time. The young medic from the 4th unit was watching from 3 feet away with an expression Nora didn't have time to interpret. She moved to the next patient. The next 40 minutes were the kind that compressed time in a specific direction. Not faster exactly, but denser, each minute carrying the weight of 3. Nora moved through the bays calling assessments, redirecting resources, identifying the gaps between what the department had and what it needed, and finding the shortest path between those two things. She didn't raise her voice after that first moment in the bay. She didn't need to. There was something in the way she moved, economical, certain, not aggressive, but completely without hesitation, that rerouted people around her the way water reroutes around a stable object. Not everyone followed her. 2 of the attending physicians ignored her corrections initially. One of them, a doctor named Ferris, physically stepped in front of her at the Bay 5 entrance and said, "I don't know who you are, but this is my patient." "Then tell me why you're planning to intubate before you've ruled out C-spine," she said. A beat. "The mechanism of injury on that vehicle impact makes cervical instability probable," she continued. "Intubating without imaging or manual stabilization in position risks secondary spinal injury." Ferris stared at her. He was older than Pollard, more experienced, and he had the particular pride of a man who was genuinely good at his job and therefore did not enjoy being corrected. He looked at the patient. He looked back at her. "Get me a C-collar," he said to the nurse beside him. Not to Nora. He didn't acknowledge her. He just changed what he was doing and moved on. That was fine. She didn't need acknowledgement. She needed the patient managed correctly. Hargrove was still in the department. She could feel him in her peripheral awareness, moving, watching, not interfering but not helping either. Managing the situation politically rather than medically, which was probably where his real skills had always lived. She registered him the way you register weather you can't control and kept working. The supply problem became critical at the 22-minute mark. A nurse named Octavia, young, fast, clearly competent, came to Nora at a near run and said, "We're out of hemorrhage control kits, completely. I've checked every closet on this floor." "Surgical floor above us," Nora said without stopping. "Closet adjacent to the OR prep room. They keep overflow surgical supply there. It's a different inventory system, so it doesn't show on the ED manifest, but it's there." Octavia stared. "How do you know that?" "I read the facility layout last night." She looked at Octavia. "Go." Octavia went. She came back 11 minutes later with an armload of kits, and the look on her face was not quite awe and not quite confusion, but something between them that would probably take a few hours to resolve into an emotion she recognized. Bev appeared again at Nora's elbow during a brief pause between incoming patients. She was breathing harder than usual, and her scrubs had blood on one sleeve that wasn't hers. 6 of the convoy casualties are military personnel, Bev said. 2 of them are asking for the chain of command. Apparently they've been told there's a designated medical officer somewhere in intake. "There isn't," Nora said. "I know, but they keep asking." Bev paused. "One of them is conscious and coherent. He's been asking for someone by name." Nora looked at her. "He asked for Commander Whitfield," Bev said carefully. 3 times. I don't know what that means." Nora was quiet for 1 second. Then she said, "Which bay?" "Und." Bay 9 was at the far end of the department, separated from the main trauma area by a short corridor that muffled some of the noise. The patient in Bay 9 was a soldier named Sergeant Dale Morrow. She could read it from the intake tag, and he was alert in the specific, effortful way of someone running on adrenaline and training rather than actual stability. He had a pressure bandage on his left forearm and a laceration above his right eyebrow that had been butterfly closed in the field. His eyes went to the door when she came through it, and what happened in his face when he saw her was not a small thing. It was the look of someone who has been holding a position alone for a long time and has just heard the sound of backup arriving. "Commander," he said, "Sergeant Morrow." She came to the bedside, assessed his condition with a quick visual. Color was okay, breathing okay, the arm was the concern. "The name is Callahan here, just a nurse." He blinked. They said you were—" "I left the service," she said. 2 years ago." He absorbed this. They said you were gone, after the Harlan Valley operation. She held her expression steady. I'm here now. How are you feeling? Like I hit a guardrail at 40 miles an hour. His voice was dry. Because I did. He looked around the bay. Commander, Callahan, something's wrong with this place. The medics in here, they seem like they're, I don't know, scrambling. They are, she said. We're managing it. The guys in the other bays, I know. I'm watching all of it. She checked the pressure bandage, lifted the edge slightly, assessed the wound beneath. It was deep but not catastrophic. You're okay. Arm's going to need suturing, might be a tendon consult. The laceration on your head is fine. He was quiet for a second. Then, the others in the convoy. There was a corporal named Jasmine Vega. She was in the third vehicle. I'll find out where she is. She's 22, he said. First deployment cycle. He stopped. His jaw moved. She didn't look good when they pulled her out. I'll find out, Nora said again. Her voice was the same. Not cold, but settled, the way a voice gets when it's been trained to carry weight without cracking under it. She found out. Corporal Vega was in Bay 2, which was where the most serious of the incoming patients had been routed after Nora's triage correction. She had a splenic laceration and a blood pressure that had been tracking downward for the past 15 minutes. The surgical team had been alerted. She was on her way to the OR. She was 22 years old, and she was frightened, and the surgical nurse holding her hand was doing what could be done about the second part while the medical team worked on the first. Nora stopped in the doorway of Bay 2 for 3 seconds, assessed everything that was happening, confirmed it was correct, and moved on. There was nothing else to do there. The team had it. You learned, eventually, to trust the teams that were working and save your intervention for the ones that weren't. So, Hargrove found her in the corridor between bays at the 40-minute mark. He had composed himself since the ambulance bay. His face was back under control, his posture reassembled into the version that appeared in the photos behind his desk. But his eyes were doing something different than the rest of him, tracking too quickly, landing too hard on things, the eyes of someone running calculations that weren't adding up. We need to talk, he said. I've got patients to. Now. He stepped slightly to the side, creating a space that wasn't quite private but was less exposed than the middle of the corridor. What you're doing right now is illegal. You're a terminated employee practicing medicine without... I'm a nurse practicing nursing, she said, which I'm licensed to do in the state of Oregon. My termination affects my employment status, not my license. You're practicing in this facility without authorization. If you want to remove me, but you'll need to explain to whoever's keeping count why you turned away assistance during a mass casualty event. She watched his face. Is that what you want on record? He was quiet. Because I'm going to tell you something, Dr. Hargrove. She kept her voice low and even. The supply discrepancies I filed yesterday, they're not an anomaly. The medication log error I filed this morning, that's not the first one either. I've been here 2 days. I found those things in 2 days. Which means either this department has extraordinarily bad luck, or someone has been managing information very deliberately. His expression didn't change. That was, in its own way, an answer. I don't know yet what the motivation is, she said. But I know what the paper trail looks like when those reports go up the chain. And they will go up the chain because I filed them through the official system before you terminated me, which means they're already in motion. Something moved behind his eyes. It was small and fast, and she almost missed it, but she'd spent 18 years reading people in conditions where missing it meant consequences, and she did not miss it. You should be very careful, he said. I usually am, she said, and walked away from him toward Bay 6, where a soldier was starting to crash. The crash in Bay 6 took everything she had for the next 20 minutes. The patient was a staff sergeant named Roland Pruitt, 41 years old, and he had been stable on intake, or appeared stable, which was not the same thing, and never had been. What he actually had was a slow internal bleed that the initial assessment had categorized as minor, and the categorization had been wrong because the intake assessment had been done fast, and by someone without enough experience with blast-adjacent trauma to know that the presentation pattern was deceptive. Nora had flagged him for a second look when she had seen his intake sheet. She hadn't gotten back to him soon enough. When his monitor alarmed, she was already in the corridor outside. She went in, assessed, called for the crash team, and then spent the next 19 minutes in the middle of a resuscitation that was not clean or controlled or anything like the way these things looked in television dramas. It was loud and physically effortful, and the margin between the outcome that happened and the outcome that almost happened was, at its narrowest point, something that didn't bear measuring. He stabilized. Not completely. He was going to need surgery, and the surgery was going to be complicated, but he was alive and moving toward the OR rather than away from it, and that was what the next hour had been for. She came out of Bay 6 into the corridor and stood still for a moment. Her hands were not shaking. They never shook during. The body saved that for after. She pressed both palms flat against the corridor wall for 3 seconds and breathed. Bev was there. She didn't say anything. She just held out a pair of fresh gloves, and Nora took them. Pruitt's going up to surgical, Nora said. I know. They're ready for him. Bev paused. You've got someone waiting. Who? Military. He came in with the transport medical team, not with the casualties. He's been asking for you for the last 10 minutes. Bev's voice was careful. He knows your name, your actual name, not Commander Whitfield. Nora looked at her. He said Callahan, Bev said. He said Nora Callahan, and he said it like he was sure. The man waiting in the small consultation room off the main corridor was not young. He was somewhere in his early 60s, with the kind of physical bearing that outlasted the uniform. Straight spine, still hands, the particular quality of stillness that comes from a life in which stillness was not rest, but readiness. He was wearing civilian clothes, but they sat on him like a concession. His name, he told her when she came in, was Warren Aldgate. He didn't offer a rank. She didn't ask for one. You're hard to find when you don't want to be found, he said. That was the point. I know. He looked at her without judgment, which was its own kind of statement. Portland, Oregon. Nurse at a level 2 trauma center. That's a long way from Harlan Valley. She didn't respond to that. We're not here about Harlan Valley, he said. We're here because 3 of the people in those ambulances were part of an active logistics unit attached to a federal oversight operation, and the convoy crash wasn't an accident. She went still. Preliminary field assessment suggests the jackknifed vehicle was staged, Aldgate said. The semi that caused the crash was reported stolen from a depot outside Tacoma 4 days ago. The driver was gone by the time first responders arrived. No plates, no registration match. He watched her face. This was a targeted disruption. Of the convoy. Of what the convoy was carrying. He paused. Specifically of the personnel in Vehicle 2, who were transporting documentation related to a federal investigation into procurement fraud in the Pacific Northwest regional medical supply chain. The air in the room shifted. She thought about the supply discrepancy. 4 boxes where 22 should have been. Months of falsified inventory logs. Medication documentation that didn't match the timeline Bev remembered. A terminated employee and a conveniently routed compliance flag. How broad, she said. We don't know yet. What we know is that Harrow Cross Medical Center appears in the preliminary documentation as a distribution endpoint. He let that land. Which means the supply irregularities you reported through the hospital's internal system yesterday and this morning are connected to what was in that convoy. Potentially. His voice was measured. We need access to the internal reporting records. We need the incident reports you filed, and we need them before hospital administration has the opportunity to reroute, delay, or bury them. She thought about Hargrove's face in the corridor, the small, fast thing that had moved behind his eyes. They may already know someone's coming, she said. Aldgate nodded slowly. That's why we moved fast. There's a federal team 12 minutes out. But if those records get altered in the next 12 minutes, I filed through the official system, she said, time-stamped, both reports. Can they be deleted from that system? She thought about it, about who would have the access level, about Hargrove's relationships with administration, about the photograph behind his desk. I don't know, she said honestly. I don't know how deep it goes. Aldgate looked at her for a moment. Then he said, the Harlan Valley operation. You filed your after-action report before you left the service. She said nothing. I read it, he said. What you documented in that report, the timeline, the decisions, the outcomes, it took someone with a specific kind of integrity to put that on paper the way you did. It wasn't easy reading. No, she said. It wasn't. Ooh, you documented things that weren't going to make your career easier. I documented what happened. He nodded. That's why I'm sitting in this room instead of talking to someone else. He stood. I need you to stay in this building. I need you to be accessible when the federal team arrives, and I need you to keep doing what you've been doing for the past hour. I was terminated this morning, she said. I'm aware. Something in his face that might have been the distant ancestor of a smile. We'll work on that. He left. She stood in the consultation room for a moment, alone. She thought about the drive from Boise to Portland 6 weeks ago, the apartment she'd rented that was quiet and had a window that looked out onto a narrow street, and a coffee shop she'd been to 3 times and was just starting to feel like a routine. She thought about routine, how badly she'd wanted it, how deliberately she'd constructed the possibility of it. She picked up her canvas bag from the floor beside the chair. She went back to the floor. The 12th minute passed, and then the 13th, and the federal team was not there yet, and the department was still running at mass casualty pace, and Nora was managing 3 simultaneous patient situations when Sandra Vale appeared at the edge of her peripheral vision and stood there in a way that meant something was wrong. She broke away for 30 seconds. What? Sandra's face was tight. Administration just sent a system message to all department heads. They're requesting a full audit hold on incident reports filed in the last 48 hours. She paused. Pending internal review. Nora understood exactly what that meant. An audit hold meant the records were frozen, not deleted, but inaccessible. No external party could pull them without a specific legal override, and a legal override took time. Time was what someone was buying. Who authorized it? Nora asked. The message came from the chief operations officer. Hargrove is listed as the requesting party. She looked at Sandra. Sandra looked back at her. The thing between them in that moment was not comfortable, but it was honest. If someone with federal authority requested those records in the next few minutes, Nora said carefully, and found them under an administrative hold, that would be a problem for whoever authorized the hold. Sandra was very still. That would be the kind of thing, Nora continued, that a compliance officer or an administrator or anyone with system access and a reason to be concerned might want to flag through an independent channel before the hold became the story. Sandra's jaw moved. That would be a significant career risk for whoever flagged it. Yes, Nora said, it would. She went back to her patients. She was at the Bay 4 bedside 30 seconds later when she heard it. Not the sounds of the department, which she'd been filtering automatically, but something underneath them. A change in the ambient pressure of the building the way pressure changes before a storm. She heard voices she didn't recognize coming from the main corridor, multiple people moving with coordinated purpose. She heard Hargrove's voice from somewhere near the nursing station say something that cut off abruptly. She heard clearly and without any ambiguity the words, "Federal agents, nobody leaves this floor." And then, from somewhere behind her, near the supply corridor that connected to the service elevator, she heard the distinct sound of a door opening and footsteps moving fast. Not toward the commotion, but away from it, and the footsteps were uneven, and they were moving in the direction of the parking structure access, and she recognized the particular rhythm of them because she had heard them behind her twice today already. She looked at Octavia, who was at the Bay 4 bedside beside her. Take over here. BP every 2 minutes. Watch the respiratory rate. Octavia said, Where are you? But Nora was already moving. The service corridor behind the supply wing was narrow and badly lit, the kind of space that existed in every large building and that nobody thought about until they needed to disappear through it. Nora moved fast, not running but close to it, her shoes quiet on the linoleum. The canvas bag was still over her shoulder because she hadn't had a moment to put it down, and it swung against her hip as she turned the corner toward the parking structure access door. She heard the door ahead of her closing. She pushed through it 12 seconds later into the concrete stairwell that connected the hospital's east wing to the attached parking structure. The stairwell smelled like exhaust and cold air and the particular staleness of a space that existed only as a conduit. She paused at the threshold and listened. Footsteps. Above her, not below. Moving up, not down. That was wrong. Someone running for a car goes down. Someone going up was going to the roof level, or the third-floor bridge that connected to the adjacent professional building, which had its own elevator bank and its own exit onto a different street entirely. She went up. She was fit in the specific functional way of someone whose fitness had always been a tool rather than an aesthetic. Not impressive to look at, but capable of things that weren't visible until they were necessary. She took the stairs at a pace that was sustainable and fast and didn't announce itself the way a full sprint would, and she came through the door onto the third-floor bridge level 30 seconds later and saw him. Hargrove had his phone to his ear. He was moving across the bridge corridor at a walk that was almost a run, the kind of pace that maintained deniability, and he hadn't heard her come through the door because the stairwell door had a pneumatic closer that brought it shut quietly, and she'd helped it along. He was saying something into the phone. She caught fragments. Have to move everything now, tonight. And the reports are on hold, but I don't know how long. And then, most clearly, because he'd stopped walking for a second and his voice had risen with it, I'm telling you they have someone inside the supply chain. If they pull the distribution records from the last 8 months, Rennick is done, I'm done, all of it. She was 15 feet behind him. He turned. The look on his face when he saw her was something she didn't have a word for immediately, and then she did. It was the look of a man whose internal model of the world had just failed completely. In his model, she was a terminated employee, a minor disruption, someone who'd filed 2 inconvenient reports and been efficiently removed. She was not supposed to be standing 15 feet behind him on a hospital bridge corridor while he said the name Rennick into a phone. He lowered the phone slowly. Dr. Hargrove, she said. He didn't respond. The federal team is on the floor below us, she said. They came for the incident report records, which are currently under an administrative hold you requested 6 minutes ago. His breathing was audible from 15 feet away. The hold is going to complicate things for you, she continued. Requesting a freeze on records at the exact moment a federal team arrives to pull those same records is the kind of timing that's difficult to explain. You don't know what you're talking about, he said. His voice was flat. I heard you say Rennick, she said. 8 months. Distribution records. Something shifted in his posture. Not defeat, not yet, but the thing that happens before defeat, when a person's options have narrowed enough that they can count them. His jaw set. His eyes went to the door at the far end of the bridge. Don't, she said. He looked back at her. I'm not going to physically stop you, she said. That's not my job. But there are 2 federal agents at the bottom of that staircase and 2 more at the main hospital entrance. And wherever you go from here, the phone call you just made has already been made. She held his gaze. It's over. He stood there for 4 seconds. She counted them. Then his shoulders dropped. Not dramatically, just a centimeter. The small, involuntary physics of a body releasing a tension it can no longer sustain. And he stood in the middle of the bridge corridor with his phone hanging at his side and said nothing. She pulled out her own phone and called the number Aldgate had given her. When someone answered, she said, 3rd floor bridge, east wing. He's here. She stayed where she was until she heard the stairwell door at the far end open. Getting back to the floor took longer than it should have, because the federal team's arrival had created a controlled chaos of its own. Personnel being interviewed, administrative staff clustered in anxious groups, the particular institutional anxiety of an organization that has just realized it's under investigation and is trying to calculate individually what that means for each of them. Nora moved through it the way she moved through everything, directly and without performance, and got back to the department at the 48-minute mark of the mass casualty response. The department was not finished needing her. Corporal Vega was out of surgery and in recovery. That information came from Bev in passing, delivered as a single sentence with a nod that meant she made it without wasting words on it. Sergeant Morrow in Bay 9 had been sutured and was stable and had, according to Octavia, asked 3 more times whether Commander Whitfield was still in the building. Octavia had told him yes each time because it was true, and because it seemed to matter to him in a way that was medical rather than sentimental. Roland Pruitt was still in surgery. That one was longer. That one was going to be what it was going to be. The remaining casualties were distributed across the department in various states of treatment, and the staff was managing them now with a coordination that hadn't existed 2 hours ago. Not because anyone had given a speech or reorganized the org chart, but because Nora had spent 48 minutes making 200 small decisions that collectively created a framework the team could work inside, and frameworks, once established, had a momentum of their own. She was checking in with Pollard, who had, she had come to understand, done the best he could with what he had, which was more than she'd initially given him credit for. When a woman she didn't recognize came through the department doors moving with a speed and intentionality that read immediately as federal. Not the same team as Aldgate's people. Different posture, different purpose. She was mid-30s, dark jacket, a lanyard with credentials, and she went directly to the nursing station and asked for Nora Callahan by name before she'd even fully stopped walking. Bev pointed. The woman came over. Special Agent Dana Rice, Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General. She held up credentials briefly. I need 10 minutes. I'm in the middle of I know. This is relevant to your patients. Nora looked at the department, did a fast calculation, and said to Bev, You've got it for 10 minutes. Bev nodded. The consultation room again. Different federal agent, same industrial chair, same humming fluorescent tube in the ceiling that was slightly too bright. Rice put a tablet on the table between them and pulled up a document. You filed 2 incident reports through Harrow Cross's internal system in the last 48 hours. Yes. The first flagged a supply discrepancy in the trauma storage, 18 units missing from an inventory count of 22. She scrolled. The second flagged a medication administration record with an unresolved contraindication flag. Both are time-stamped in the system, Nora said. They are. And we have them. Rice looked up. The administrative hold Hargrove requested didn't complete. Someone on the administrative staff flagged it to an independent compliance channel before it processed, which delayed the hold's authorization. Sandra, Nora thought. She kept her face neutral. What that means, Rice continued, is that your reports are intact and accessible, which gives us a documented paper trail inside this facility going back to your first shift. She set the tablet down. I need you to walk me through everything you observed, not just what's in the reports, everything. Starting where? Starting with the supply closet. Nora talked for 7 minutes, factual and sequential, no editorializing, the way she'd been trained to debrief. This happened, then this, then this. Here is what I observed. Here is what I inferred. Here is the distinction between those two things. Rice took notes on the tablet without interrupting. When Nora finished, Rice was quiet for a moment. The name Rennick, Rice said. You heard Hargrove say it. Yes? In context of distribution records and an 8-month window. Yes. Reese nodded slowly. Marcus Rennick is the regional director of a medical supply distribution company called Pacifica MedSource. They're the primary supplier for 11 hospital systems in Oregon and Washington. She paused. We've been building a case against Pacifica for approximately 6 months. Billing fraud, supply diversion, falsified delivery documentation. The hospitals that appear in our records as distribution endpoints were, in most cases, unaware of the fraud. They were receiving shorted supplies and being billed for full quantities. Most cases, Nora said. Most, Rice confirmed. Harrow Cross is in a different category. Our preliminary review suggests that someone within hospital administration was aware of the shortage and was, for reasons we're still determining, cooperating with it. Hargrove, Nora said. Potentially. We don't have direct evidence of his involvement yet beyond what you heard on the bridge, which is useful but not sufficient alone. Rice looked at her. What we do have now is your incident reports as the first internal documentation of the supply discrepancies, filed before anyone in administration knew we were coming. That's significant. That establishes that the problem was observable and reportable, which undermines any future claim that the shortages were invisible or unintentional. Nora thought about the 2 patients Bev had mentioned. February. The delayed hemorrhage control. the altered timeline in the documentation. There's a nurse on staff named Beverly Okafor, she said. She has first-hand recollection of incidents in February that involved supply delays affecting patient care. She also believes the documentation from those cases was altered after the fact. Rice's expression sharpened. Is she willing to make a statement? I don't know. That's her decision. Nora paused. But she's here. And she's the kind of person who doesn't say things she doesn't mean. Rice made a note. Then she said, one more thing. The convoy crash. You were briefed by Warren Aldgate. Yes. What he told you about the convoy's cargo is accurate. The personnel in Vehicle 2 were federal couriers. The documentation they were transporting was a subset of the Pacifica MedSource case file. Physical copies, backed up, so the loss wouldn't have ended the investigation, but it would have set us back. She folded her hands on the table. We believe the crash was intended to create exactly this kind of chaos. Overwhelm a hospital that was already compromised, destroy evidence in transit, and in the confusion, create an opportunity to clean house internally. Someone knew the convoy's route, Nora said. Yes. And someone knew this hospital's vulnerabilities well enough to know it would be overwhelmed. Yes. Rice looked at her steadily. Which means the coordination goes beyond Hargrove, beyond this building. The fluorescent light hummed above them. How many hospitals? Nora asked. In the distribution network? 11. Rice paused. In terms of internal cooperation, we don't know yet. Harrow Cross is the one we can place. The others are still under review. Patients, Nora said. How many patients have been affected by shorted supplies across those 11 systems? Rice didn't answer immediately, and the length of that pause was its own kind of answer. We're still compiling, she said finally. Nora sat with that for a moment. The scope of it. The specific weight of what it meant when fraud that existed on a spreadsheet translated into the human body of a person in a trauma bay who waited 8 minutes longer than they should have for hemorrhage control. What do you need from me? She said. A formal statement, witness cooperation, and, if you're willing, continued access to this department while we execute the investigation. Rice met her eyes. Your employment status is a complication we're working to resolve. Aldgate is coordinating with hospital administration. The hospital administration that may be implicated in a federal investigation. The board of directors, Rice clarified. Not Hargrove. They've been told what's happening, and they are, as of approximately 20 minutes ago, very motivated to cooperate. Nora almost said something dry about that, but kept it. Okay, she said. Statement, cooperation. Whatever you need. She stood. Miss Callahan. Rice's voice stopped her at the door. The bridge. Following Hargrove up there. That was a significant personal risk. It was a calculated one, Nora said. You could have let him go. The federal team would have found him eventually. Eventually, she agreed. But eventually he might have finished that phone call. She went back to the floor. Roland Pruitt came out of surgery at the 2-hour mark. The surgical team's attending, a compact woman named Dr. Sable, who operated with a focused minimalism that Nora respected immediately, found Nora in the corridor afterward and gave her the summary in the direct shorthand of one clinical professional to another, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Splenic repair, successful, retroperitoneal bleed, controlled. He'll need monitoring for renal function over the next 72 hours, but the structural damage is addressed. She paused. The initial categorization of his injury as minor contributed to a delay in surgical referral. He should have gone up an hour earlier. I know, Nora said. I flagged him for a secondary assessment. I didn't get back to him in time. Sable looked at her. You were managing 13 other patients simultaneously. Yes? I'm not criticizing. I know you're not, Nora said. I'm just being accurate. Sable studied her for a moment. Who are you? It was the question of the day, in its various forms. Nora gave her the same version she'd given everyone. The name, the nursing license, the 2-day employment history. Sable listened, and her expression shifted in the way expressions did when the information didn't match the pattern. A person who managed a 2-hour mass casualty response, with the structural logic Nora had applied, was not a profile that fit walk-in clinic background and 2 years in an outpatient setting in Boise. Before Boise, Sable said. It's a long answer. I have time. I don't, Nora said, and moved on. The afternoon wore on and the department began to stabilize in increments, the acute crisis resolving into the sustained management phase that was in some ways harder because the adrenaline had metabolized, and what remained was the work itself, patient by patient, decision by decision, without the focused clarity that emergency conditions generated. Nora worked through it. She was tired in a way she recognized, not the tired of having done too much, but the tired of having done exactly the right amount of a very hard thing, which was a different quality of exhaustion. She'd been running on discipline and pattern recognition since she walked back through those bay doors, and the patterns were still running correctly, but she was aware of the mechanism in a way she usually wasn't. Sergeant Morrow was cleared for discharge late in the afternoon. She stopped by Bay 9 before he left. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, pulling on a jacket, his right arm through the sleeve, his left arm in a temporary brace, working at it with the determined patience of someone accustomed to managing a round injury. He looked up when she came in. "They told me you're not technically supposed to be here," he said. "That's been the theme of the day." He almost smiled. "Vega's okay." "I know, I checked." "She didn't know who you were. Didn't know the name." He finished with the jacket, looked at his hands for a second. "I didn't tell anyone. About Harlan Valley. About who you actually are." "I know," she said. "The medic did, this morning, but that's okay." Morrow looked up. "Is it?" She thought about that honestly. "It's complicated," she said. "But yes." He nodded. Then he said, "The Harlan Valley operation, the after-action report. We heard, some of us heard, what you put in it, what you documented." She kept her face still. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "The way you wrote it, the timeline of the decision sequence, that wasn't going to help your career." "It was what happened," she said. "I know." His voice was quiet. "But the way you told it mattered. The way you told it meant the right people got evaluated and the wrong call got identified instead of the other version, the version where it just goes into a file and nothing changes." He paused. "Some of us know that. Some of us have always known that." She stood there with that for a moment. "Get some rest, Sergeant," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Not Commander. Not Whitfield. Her name wasn't in it at all, and somehow that made it mean more. At 4 in the afternoon, Warren Aldgate found her at the nursing station updating charts with the focused attention of someone closing a loop. "Hargrove's been detained," he said. "He's cooperating. Apparently once the conversation on the bridge was raised, the calculus changed for him." A pause. "He's providing names." "Rennick," she said. "Rennick, and 2 others within hospital administration." He looked at the department around them. "The board has reinstated your employment, effective immediately, pending full HR processing. It's not elegant, but it's functional." She kept charting. "What about the reports from February, the ones Bev Okafor remembered with altered documentation?" "Rice is pulling them. If the alteration is there and forensically recoverable from the system logs, that's additional evidence of deliberate concealment." He paused. "It also means those patients may be entitled to review of their cases." "They are," she said. Not a question. "I know." He looked at her sideways. "You're not going to make this simple, are you?" "Simple doesn't help those patients," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "There's something else. The investigation, the scope of it, the documentation, the supply chain network across 11 hospital systems. It's going to need someone who can translate between the medical and institutional dimensions. Someone who understands what the supply gaps mean in clinical terms, not just financial ones." She looked at him. "There's a federal coordinating role," he said. "Temporary, 6-month appointment, consulting status, working with the OIG team." "I have a job," she said. "As of 4 hours ago, you have 2. She turned back to the chart. "Talk to me next week." "Fair enough." He straightened. "One more thing. The convoy crash. We recovered the staging vehicle, the semi. Forensics is working it, but initial assessment found a GPS device in the cab, hard-mounted, professional installation. Not the kind of thing someone does casually. She processed that. They knew the route and the timing. Yes. And the device has a signal origin we're tracking. It goes back to a facility in the Portland metro area. He said the next part carefully. Initial triangulation puts the origin point within approximately 3 miles of Harrow Cross Medical Center. The implication landed with a weight that she didn't let show on her face. Someone close. Someone with institutional knowledge of the hospital, of the supply systems, of what was here and what was coming. Not just Hargrove. Hargrove didn't strike her as the kind of person who managed GPS installations in stolen semi-trucks. Hargrove was the institutional layer. There was another layer beneath him. Rennick, she said, or someone working for Rennick. We don't know yet where that layer ends. Aldgate looked at her steadily. What I'm telling you is that this building, this department, it's still a live scene, and the person or persons who staged that crash haven't been identified. She understood him. The federal team was here. Agents were on the floor. Hargrove was in custody. But the network that had built this fraud had staged a crash, had managed a supply scheme across 11 hospital systems. That network was larger than one hospital administrator and a regional distribution director, and its edges weren't visible yet. You think someone's still in this building, she said. I think we don't know what we don't know, he said, and I think you should be aware of that. He left. She stood at the nursing station for a moment with the chart in her hands. Around her, the department moved in its late afternoon rhythm, quieter than the morning's chaos, but not quiet. It was never quiet here, and she was starting to understand that this wasn't going to resolve itself into the simplicity she'd wanted when she drove from Boise to Portland and signed a lease on an apartment with a window that looked onto a coffee shop. She thought about what Aldgate had said. Someone's still in the building. She looked at the department. She looked at the staff moving through it. Bev, Octavia, Pollard, the faces she'd been building maps of for 2 days, the people who'd watched her and tested her and followed her, and some of whom had not. The people she knew and the people she didn't. She went back to the chart. 40 minutes later, Bev came to find her. Rice's team pulled the February records, Bev said. Her voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it. The original documentation. System logs show the case files were accessed and modified 11 days after the incidents. Timestamps, treatment timelines, supply usage records. She paused. All of it. Good, Nora said. That's the forensic trail they needed. The access logs show who modified them. Nora looked at her. Bev's expression was doing something complicated. It wasn't Hargrove, she said. Hargrove doesn't have that level of system access. Records modification at that depth requires a clinical administrator or a senior physician with elevated permissions. Who was it? Bev was quiet for a second, not reluctant exactly, but carrying the weight of someone who has just had a thing confirmed that they suspected and wished they hadn't. Dr. Ferris, she said. Nora went still. Ferris. Bay 5. C-spine protocol. The doctor who had blocked her path and then corrected his approach without acknowledging her. The doctor she had assessed as prideful and stubborn and ultimately competent in the way that had let her move past him and focus elsewhere. The doctor who was currently in this building. The doctor who, if Aldgate's assessment was correct and someone here was still connected to the network that had staged the convoy crash, had just had his access logs pulled by a federal team and didn't know yet whether that meant they were looking at him. Where is he? Nora said. I don't know, Bev said. He finished his shift 20 minutes ago. He signed out. But I saw him go toward the back of the building, not toward the parking structure. The back of the building. The loading dock, Bev said, where the supply deliveries come in. Nora was already moving, and she was pulling out her phone, and she was calling Rice. And as the call connected, she pushed through the door into the service corridor and heard, from somewhere ahead of her in the direction of the loading dock, a sound she recognized from a decade of field work. The sound of a door that had just been propped open, being propped open in a deliberate and careful way. Not open. Held. Held for someone on the other side. Rice picked up on the second ring, and Nora said, without preamble, "Loading dock, East Service Corridor, right now, and bring someone with you." She kept moving through the corridor, phone to her ear, and she was 8 feet from the loading dock door when it opened from the outside, and the person who came through it was not Dr. Ferris. It was a woman she'd never seen before, in a Pacifica MedSource delivery uniform, carrying a tablet and moving with the practiced normalness of someone who had done this exact walk many times and needed it to look exactly that way. Behind her, Dr. Ferris stepped away from the door he'd been holding and saw Nora's face. The woman in the Pacifica uniform saw Nora's face. For 1 second, the three of them were in the corridor together, and nobody moved. And in that second, Nora had time to understand that the tablet the woman was carrying was not a delivery manifest. It was the kind of device you use to wipe a system. And behind the woman in the Pacifica uniform, through the loading dock door that was still swinging slowly closed, she could see the side of a white van with the engine running. The woman in the Pacifica uniform moved first. She moved left, toward the service corridor's secondary door, and she moved fast, and the tablet was already going into the bag over her shoulder in the practiced motion of someone who had planned for exactly this contingency. Ferris went right, back toward the loading dock door, and the white van's engine was still running beyond it, and both of these things were happening simultaneously in the space of about 2 seconds. Nora blocked Ferris. She didn't tackle him, didn't grab him, just stepped into the geometry of his movement the way you step into a doorway, making herself the obstacle rather than the pursuer. And he ran into her with his shoulder and they both went into the corridor wall, and the impact was not clean. Her elbow hit the concrete and she felt it up to her shoulder blade, a bright specific pain that she registered and filed and moved past. She got her hand on his wrist before he recovered his balance. And she didn't try to hold him with strength because he was larger than her. And she'd learned a long time ago that strength contests with larger opponents were a poor tactical choice. She held his wrist and used his own momentum to redirect him into the wall a second time, face first this time, and said into the phone that was somehow still in her other hand, "Service corridor now." 10 seconds, Rice said. Ferris twisted. He was stronger than she'd expected and angrier, and his elbow came back toward her ribs. She moved with it instead of against it, and the blow landed partially, not where he'd aimed, and she locked his arm and held position. "Stop," she said, close to his ear. "There is nowhere you're going." He stopped straining, not because he'd accepted it, but because something in her voice communicated the same information her body position was communicating, which was that she had done this before and he hadn't, and the math wasn't going to improve for him. The corridor door burst open and 2 federal agents came through at a run. And behind them Rice, and behind Rice, 3 seconds later, Aldgate, who had been faster than any of them anticipated for a man his age. The Pacifica woman was against the far wall with an agent's hand on her shoulder and was saying, in a voice that had gone very flat, "I want a lawyer." Ferris, against the wall beside Nora, was breathing hard and not saying anything. Nora stepped back. Her elbow was going to bruise. She pressed it against her side briefly, assessed the pain, sharp, probably bone, possibly a minor fracture, the kind of thing you dealt with after, and let go of the arm she'd been holding. Rice came up beside her. She looked at Ferris against the wall, and then at the bag the Pacifica agent was removing from the woman in the delivery uniform. The tablet was inside it. Rice had it opened and was looking at the screen within 30 seconds. "Remote wipe tool," she said, "configured for the HeroCross internal network." She looked up at Ferris. "Physician credentials and an internal access code to get close enough to execute it." She let that sit. "How long have you been in the network, Dr. Ferris?" He didn't answer. "The February records," she said. "The access logs. Those were you." Still nothing. "We have your credentials stamped on the modification timestamps," Rice said. "That's not a question. I'm giving you the opportunity to give us context before we establish context for you." Ferris looked at the floor. His breathing had slowed. He had the look of a man whose calculation had finally completed and produced an answer he didn't like. "I want an attorney," he said. "That's your right," Rice said, and nodded to the agent beside him. They took both of them out through the loading dock. The white van's keys were in it, the engine still running, and inside the van's cargo space there were 2 server drives in a foam-lined case, the kind of case that suggested they'd been packed for transport with some care. Aldgate stood at the open cargo doors looking at the drives for a long moment, and when he turned to Nora he had the expression of someone who has just found the last piece of a thing they'd been looking for. Hospital's backup server archive, he said. Physical extraction. If this had gotten out of this building tonight, we'd have been working from incomplete records for months. She looked at the drives. She thought about months. She thought about 11 hospital systems and however many patients had moved through those systems in the time it would have taken to reconstruct a complete evidence trail from incomplete records. Ferris didn't do this alone, she said. No, he didn't. Aldgate closed the cargo doors. The woman with the tablet. She's field operations for Rennick's network. Courier and technical. We've had a partial ID on her for 3 months but couldn't place her. He looked at Nora. You just placed her. I followed a sound, she said. You followed a sound and read a situation correctly under pressure. He held her gaze. That's not nothing. That's what the last 18 years of your life built. She let that land without deflecting it, which was harder than it sounded. Go get your elbow looked at, he said. She looked down at it. The sleeve of her scrub top was pushed up slightly where it had caught on the wall, and the elbow was already showing the preliminary purple of serious bruising. I have patience, she said. You have an injury, he said. Bev Okafor has your patience. I asked her 10 minutes ago. She blinked. When? When I realized you were moving toward the loading dock without backup. He said it without apology or excessive elaboration. I made a call. She went and got her elbow looked at. The radiology result came back as a non-displaced fracture of the olecranon, the point of the elbow, small and painful and requiring a splint and rest and nothing more dramatic than that. The ER physician who looked at it, a young woman named Tran who had been managing the non-trauma cases through the entire afternoon and was visibly exhausted, did not ask how it happened because the afternoon had been the kind of afternoon that made you stop asking that particular question. Splint, Tran said. 6 weeks minimum. You can't lift with this. I know. Or flex under load. I know. Tran looked at her with the specific expression of a clinician who has just told a patient something the patient is going to ignore. I'm documenting that I told you. That's appropriate, Nora said. She went back to the floor with a splint on her left elbow and a prescription for anti-inflammatories that she put in her bag and kept moving. The department at 6 in the evening was quieter than it had been at any point in the past 9 hours. The mass casualty surge had been absorbed, the critical patients were in surgical recovery or stabilized in monitored beds, and the normal rhythm of a busy evening emergency department was reasserting itself. The walk-ins, the transfers, the non-convoy injured who had needs that had been carefully triaged into second priority and were now being worked through in order. Bev found her at the nursing station. Ferris? Bev said, and stopped. I know, Nora said. Bev looked at her hands for a moment. I worked with him for 4 years. Nora waited. I didn't like him, Bev said. He was the kind of doctor who treated nursing staff like support equipment, but I didn't... She stopped again. I didn't think he was this. Most people aren't obviously this, Nora said. That's what makes it work. Does that make it better? No, she said honestly. It doesn't. Bev was quiet for a moment. Then, the February patients, the ones I remembered? Race's team has the records, the original records from the system logs before the modification. The timeline will be reconstructed. She looked at Bev. You'll be asked to make a formal statement about what you remembered, about the discrepancy between what you saw and what the documentation said. I know. Bev's voice was steady. I already talked to Rice this afternoon, after the thing with Sandra and the hold. Nora registered that. You talked to Rice? Sandra tipped the compliance channel. I gave the clinical context. Bev's expression was complicated. I should have done something like that months ago. You didn't have the same information months ago. I had enough to know something was wrong. Nora considered that. She could say something reassuring, something that redistributed the responsibility more generously than Bev was distributing it. She decided against it because Bev didn't seem to want that, and because it wasn't entirely true, and because one of the things she'd learned at some personal cost was that accurate accounting, even when it stung, was more useful long-term than comfortable accounting. You're making the statement, Nora said. That matters now. Bev nodded. It was an absolution, and she didn't take it as such, which was probably the right response. Marcus Rennick was arrested at 7:14 in the evening at the Pacifica MedSource regional office in Beaverton, Oregon. Nora learned about it from Aldgate's text message, which read, Rennick in custody. Distribution records seized, 11 systems. And then, a minute later, good work today. She was in the break room when she read it, sitting at the small table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago and a sandwich she'd unwrapped but not eaten. The break room was empty. Someone had left a TV on, muted, playing regional news on a wall mount. She watched the muted images. The parking lot of a building she didn't recognize, people in dark jackets moving in and out of it, the chyron at the bottom reading something about a federal investigation. The Pacifica MedSource story was going to be large. It was going to be the kind of news that built for several days and then hit fully when the court filings became public. 11 hospital systems, 8 months of documented fraud, a supply chain that had shorted medical equipment to emergency departments across Oregon and Washington and billed for full delivery while patients waited for hemorrhage control kits that weren't there. She thought about the patients she would never know about, the ones in the other 10 systems, in ERs she'd never walked into, attended by nurses and doctors who had noticed the same gaps she'd noticed and either reported them or hadn't, who had managed around the shortfalls or had been unable to, whose names were in files she would never see. She thought about what Rice had said when she'd asked how many patients had been affected. We're still compiling. She ate the sandwich. The board of directors met in emergency session at 8 o'clock. Nora wasn't in the meeting. She was on the floor where she was still needed and where she preferred to be, but Aldgate gave her the summary afterward. The board had accepted Hargrove's suspension pending the outcome of the federal investigation. They had issued a formal request for Ferris's medical privileges to be immediately suspended, which was the procedural step before formal license review. They had authorized full cooperation with the OIG team's access to the hospital's financial and operational records. They had also, Aldgate said, reinstated Nora's employment with full retroactive compensation for the 2 days she'd been, as he put it, administratively separated. The phrase they used in the resolution, Aldgate said, was significant error in judgment leading to the termination of a key clinical contributor. It's not an apology exactly. It's a legal document, she said. It doesn't need to be an apology. There's also a compensation offer, beyond the retroactive pay. He named a figure. For the work you did today, and for the federal consulting role if you accept it. She looked at him. You walked back into a facility that had just fired you, he said, during a mass casualty event, with a terminated badge and ran a triage operation that the medical examiner's preliminary assessment suggests prevented at least 3 preventable deaths. The team ran the operation, she said. Callahan. What? Stop doing that, he said, not unkindly. She looked at the coffee cup. Give me the paperwork, she said. I'll look at the numbers. Type it. At 9 in the evening, Octavia caught her near the medication room and said, There's something on the second floor you should probably see. The second floor of Harrow Cross was administrative. Offices, conference rooms, the HR suite, the COO's domain. It was not, ordinarily, somewhere the nursing staff went at 9 in the evening. But Octavia said it with the particular intentionality of someone who had been asked to deliver a message, and Nora followed her up. The conference room was occupied. There were 6 people in it. 3 of them were nursing staff she recognized, Sandra Vale, and 2 day-shift nurses named Paula Kern and Reggie Ito, who had watched Nora with various degrees of wariness over the past 2 days. 2 of them were people she'd seen in the federal team's orbit. And one of them, at the head of the table, was a woman in her 60s with the specific posture of institutional authority. Not commanding, exactly, but settled, the way a person settles when they have been responsible for large things for a long time and have stopped needing to perform that responsibility. She introduced herself as Margaret Ashby, the chair of the board. I've been asking about you all afternoon, Ashby said. Every person I've talked to has told me something different. About me? Nora said. About what happened in this building today. Ashby gestured at the chair across from her. Sit down, please. Nora sat. "I've been chair of this board for 6 years," Ashby said. "I did not know what was happening in this hospital's emergency department. I want to say that clearly because I think clarity matters, and I think you're someone who values it. I appreciate that. I also want to say, with equal clarity, that not knowing is not the same as not being responsible." Her voice was even. "The governance failures that allowed this to persist are partially mine. The board's. We didn't look where we should have looked. We trusted where we should have verified." Nora waited. "The federal investigation will take time. The clinical review of the affected cases will take time. Rebuilding whatever we need to rebuild in this department's culture and operations will take time." Ashby looked at her steadily. "I'd like you to be part of that process, in a formal capacity, not just a nursing role." Aldgate mentioned a consulting position. "I'm talking about something within this institution," Ashby said. "Director of Emergency Operations. It's a new role. We're creating it. It would carry clinical and administrative scope. You would have the authority to flag and escalate anything you consider a safety risk directly to the board without going through department chiefs." The room was quiet. Nora thought about the apartment with the window, the coffee shop 3 blocks down, the one she'd been to 3 times, and was starting to feel like a routine. She thought about Bay 6 and Roland Pruitt and the 8 minutes she hadn't gotten back to him. She thought about the patients she didn't know, in the 10 other hospital systems, in the files she'd never see. "I'll need to see the position scope in writing," she said, "and I'll need independent reporting authority. Not contingent on board approval, direct and unconditional." "That can be structured," Ashby said. "I'll also need the February case files reviewed by an independent clinical panel. Not internal. External reviewers with findings made available to the affected patients." Ashby nodded slowly. "That's appropriate. And Bev Okafor's statement to the federal team should be treated as a formal protected disclosure under whistleblower statutes. She should have counsel confirming that before she signs anything. I'll have legal reach out to her tomorrow morning." Nora looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked back at Ashby. "I'll need a few days to think about the role." Ashby's expression shifted slightly. Surprise, maybe, or respect, or the recognition that she was sitting across from someone who was not going to be rushed into anything, regardless of the circumstances. "Take the time you need," she said. It was past 10 when Nora finally left the building. She came out through the main entrance this time, not the ambulance bay, not the service corridor. The lobby was quiet at this hour. A security guard at the desk, a family in the corner, in the specific exhausted configuration of people who had been waiting a long time and were going to wait longer. The automatic doors opened and she walked out into the Portland night, which was cool and had finally started to rain, the fine persistent rain that this city made its signature. She stood on the sidewalk outside Harrow Cross Medical Center with her canvas bag over her right shoulder and her left elbow in a splint and let the rain touch her face for a moment. She was tired. Not the clean tiredness of having done a straightforward thing well, but the complicated tiredness of a day that had been made of approximately 40 different decisions under pressure, some of which had been right and some of which had probably not been optimal, and at least one of which had resulted in a non-displaced elbow fracture. She was hungry in the sustained background way that meant she'd been ignoring hunger for hours. Her feet hurt. None of this was interesting. All of it was real. She started walking toward the parking structure where she'd left her car at 7:30 that morning, which was now 14 and a half hours ago. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. The number was unfamiliar, an area code she recognized as Northern Virginia. She answered. "Ms. Callahan." A man's voice. Careful, measured, the kind of voice that chose its words the way a person chooses footing on uncertain ground. "My name is Director Lorne Castellan. I'm with the Federal Coordinating Office of the Inspector General Network." "All right," she said. "I've been briefed on what happened at Harrow Cross today. The mass casualty response, the supply chain connection, the individuals taken into custody." A brief pause. "And on your role in each of those outcomes." She kept walking. The rain was picking up slightly. "I'd like to talk with you," Castellan said. "Not about today specifically. About the broader investigation, the 11 hospital systems, the supply chain network, the question of how deep the coordination goes." "Rice is running the OIG case," she said. Rice is running the Portland field component, he said. I'm asking about the national picture. Another pause. We've identified connection points in the Pacifica MedSource network that extend beyond the Pacific Northwest. Seattle, Portland, Boise. Those are confirmed. But the distribution model suggests a broader infrastructure. We're looking at medical supply fraud on a scale that hasn't been prosecuted in this country before. She stopped walking. I'm a nurse, she said. I work emergency medicine. You spent 18 years as a combat trauma officer with federal clearance and an incident command background, Castellan said. You ran a mass casualty response today in a compromised facility and identified a network insider that a 6-month federal investigation had failed to place. His voice stayed even. With respect, you're more than a nurse. She stood in the rain outside the parking structure entrance and thought about the apartment, the window, the coffee shop. She thought about, we're still compiling. What are you asking? She said. I'm asking if you'd be willing to meet, he said. In person, this week, if possible. There are aspects of what we found that I'd prefer to discuss in a secure setting. She looked at the rain hitting the concrete. I'll need to make some arrangements, she said. Of course. And I'll need a full briefing document before the meeting, not a summary, the complete picture as far as you have it. That's reasonable. Send it through Rice, she said. I trust her handling. A beat. That's a notable standard of care for someone you met 12 hours ago. She earned it in 12 hours, Nora said. Some people do that. She ended the call. She stood there for another moment, rain coming down steadily now, the parking structure entrance lit by a single overhead light that was doing its best against the dark. She'd come to Portland for quiet. She'd come for routine, for a coffee shop that was starting to feel familiar, for mornings that didn't require her to make decisions that cost people something if she got them wrong. She was standing in the rain outside a hospital where 2 doctors had just been arrested, a supply fraud network was unraveling across 11 states, and a federal director in Northern Virginia wanted to talk to her about a national investigation she hadn't known existed this morning. She thought about Sergeant Morrow's voice in Bay 9. The way you told it mattered. She thought about Corporal Vega, 22 years old, coming out of surgery. She thought about the tablet in the Pacifica Courier's bag, configured to wipe records that would have taken months to reconstruct, and what those months would have meant for the people those records were about. She pulled out her phone and called Aldgate. He answered on the second ring. Castellan called me, she said. Aldgate was quiet for a moment. He moves fast. Did you know he was going to? I knew he was briefed. I didn't know the timeline. A pause. What did you tell him? I told him to send a briefing document through Rice. And the meeting? I didn't say no, she said. Aldgate let out a slow breath. It wasn't surprise. It was something else. Something that might have been relief or might have been the weight of a person who had been carrying a problem for a long time and had just watched it become someone else's problem too, and was not entirely sure how he felt about that. There's something you should know before you read the briefing document, he said. His voice had changed slightly, careful in a different way than before. Something that's in it that I want you to hear it from me first. She waited. The Harlan Valley operation, he said. Her hand tightened on the phone. The after-action report you filed before you left the service, he said. The timeline. The decision sequence you documented. He stopped. One of the individuals named in that report, named in the context of a command decision that you documented as contributing to the operational outcome, is in the Pacifica MedSource case file. She stood very still. Not as a suspect, he said quickly. As a witness. A former logistics officer who left the military 18 months before you did and went into private sector distribution management. He paused. His name is in Pacifica's corporate filing as a regional operations consultant. She understood what he was telling her. The things she'd documented in Harlan Valley. The after-action report she'd filed, knowing it would make her career harder. The decision sequence she'd put on paper because it was what happened, regardless of what putting it on paper would cost her. That document was now connected, through a chain of people and decisions she hadn't known about, to a fraud network that had shorted emergency medical supplies to 11 hospital systems. The The person she'd documented making a wrong call in a combat zone had 18 months later gone to work for the people stealing from hospitals. "Callahan," Aldgate said. "I'm here," she said. "The briefing document will have his full profile. I wanted you to know before you read it cold." She looked at the rain. "Who else knows about the connection to Harlan Valley?" she said. "Castellan? Rice? Me." A pause. "And whoever in the Pacifica network knew your name well enough to flag it when you showed up at Harrow Cross." The rain hit the concrete around her feet. "They knew I was coming," she said slowly, "before I filed the first report." "We think so," Aldgate said. "We think your hire at Harrow Cross may have triggered a flag in the Pacifica network. Someone connected to that operation who recognized your name from another context and reported it up. Which means Hargrove knew who I was when he terminated me. Not necessarily who you were in full," Aldgate said, "but that you were someone worth removing quickly." He paused. "Which also means the termination wasn't just about protecting the supply chain. It was specifically about you." She stood in the rain for a long moment. "Send me the briefing document," she said. "Race will have it by morning." She ended the call. She stood outside the parking structure for 30 more seconds, rain soaking through her scrub top, elbow aching in its splint. The city quiet around her in the specific way cities got quiet after 10 on a weeknight. Not empty, but muted. The daily noise turned down without being turned off. Then she went to her car, and she drove home. And she sat at her kitchen table in the apartment with the window and made herself eat something. And she did not sleep well because sleeping well would have required not thinking, and there was too much to think about. At 5:43 in the morning, her phone showed a notification. Secure document received, Rice's credentials, encrypted transfer. She made coffee first. She sat at the kitchen table with the coffee and opened the document. The first page was the case summary she'd expected. Pacifica MedSource, 11 systems, the supply chain architecture, the financial fraud figures. She read it quickly because she already had the shape of it. The second page was the witness list. She found the name on the third line. She sat with it. The name was someone she'd spent 18 months trying not to think about, and had mostly managed it, and had built a life in Boise partly around the achievement of not thinking about it, and had come to Portland for the continued project of not thinking about it. The name was someone who had known her methods, her instincts, her patterns of observation, had worked alongside her long enough to know how she thought and what she looked for, and how she moved through a problem, and had apparently known her well enough to recognize her name on a staff manifest at Harrow Cross Medical Center, and understand exactly what it meant that she was there. She set the coffee cup down. She picked up the phone and called Rice. "You read it," Rice said, instead of hello. "Who else in the Pacifica network had access to the flag system?" Nora said. "The one that would have triggered when my name appeared on the Harrow Cross hiring manifest." "That's what we're trying to determine," Rice said. "The flag system is proprietary. Rennick built it. We have the architecture, but we don't have the full access list yet." "How long to get it?" "Days, maybe a week." "What do you have on the witness from Harlan Valley?" Rice was quiet for a second. "He's cooperative," she said carefully. "He came in voluntarily when we made contact last night. He's provided an initial statement." "About the Pacifica network?" "About his role, yes. He says it was peripheral. Consulting, logistics review, nothing directly connected to the supply diversion scheme." A pause. "His attorney is arguing he was unaware of the fraudulent component." "And the flag on my name?" A longer pause this time. "He says he didn't trigger it," Rice said, "but he knew about it." Silence. "Rice. He says he was told 3 weeks ago that your name had appeared in a hiring manifest. He says he didn't take any action in response to that information." Her voice was measured and professional, and under it, just barely, something that might have been discomfort. "He says he considered contacting you directly, but decided against it." Nora sat at the kitchen table with the coffee going cold in front of her and looked at the window and the narrow street beyond it and the coffee shop 3 doors down that was just opening for the morning. "Who told him?" she said. "We don't know yet," Rice said. "That's the thread we're pulling. Someone in the Pacifica network knew my name from the Harlan Valley connection and flagged my hire to someone with access to the witness, and the witness didn't report it." That's the current picture, Rice said. Yes. Nora thought about Hargrove receiving a flag about a new hire, a name that meant something to someone in the network. A quick termination, well inside the probationary window, clean and unremarkable on paper. The kind of removal that would have been invisible if there hadn't been a convoy crash, if there hadn't been a mass casualty event that brought her back through the bay doors, if there hadn't been a soldier who recognized her face. The crash, she said. Was the convoy crash about the evidence, or was it about creating the conditions that brought me back into the building? Rice said nothing for 3 seconds. That question is in the active investigation file, she said. I can't confirm or deny it. Which meant they'd already thought of it, which meant it was possible that the chaos that had pulled Nora back through those doors, the event that had looked like coincidence, like the specific bad luck of a crash on Highway 26 routing casualties to the nearest Level 2 trauma center, might not have been coincidence at all, might have been designed to put her in a building that was already prepared to deal with her. She looked at the window. The coffee shop was open now, lights on, a person behind the counter moving through the first tasks of the morning. She picked up her cup, realized it was cold, and went to the kitchen to pour it out and make another. She stood at the kitchen counter waiting for the coffee to brew and thought about the shape of what she knew. Someone in the Pacifica network had recognized her name on a hiring manifest. They had flagged it to the person from Harlan Valley, who had sat on the information. The flag had also reached Hargrove, who had moved fast, faster than a routine probationary termination, to remove her before she found anything. And then the convoy crash had happened, routing casualties to Harrow Cross, pulling her back through the doors she'd just walked out of. The question Rice hadn't confirmed or denied was whether the crash had been designed to do exactly that. She thought about the tactical logic of it. If the goal had been simply to keep her out of the building, termination had already accomplished that. She'd been leaving. She'd been standing on the sidewalk with her bag over her shoulder, and she would have driven away, and that would have been the end of it. But someone in the network had known enough about her to know that a mass casualty event involving military personnel would bring her back, knew her history, knew her patterns, knew what she couldn't walk away from. That required a specific kind of knowledge, not a name on a manifest, something more personal than that. She poured the coffee. She sat back down at the table and opened the briefing document to the section on the Pacifica Network's internal communications, the ones recovered from Rennick's office servers during the Beaverton arrest. The OIG team had flagged several for her specifically, highlighted in the document with a notation that read, "See attached analysis." She read for 40 minutes. By the end of it, she had a name she hadn't expected, and the shape of something that had been underneath everything else all along, and the specific quality of stillness that came when a thing you'd been moving around finally stopped moving and stood still enough to be seen clearly. She called Rice. "I need to talk to Castellan today," she said. "Not this week. Today." Rice didn't ask why. "I'll make it happen," she said. The meeting with Castellan was secured through a video link at noon, encrypted, Rice present on her end, 2 of Castellan's staff visible in the background of his office in Northern Virginia. He was, as his voice had suggested, deliberate, contained, the kind of man who had spent decades in institutions without becoming entirely institutional, which was a balance that required constant maintenance. He let her talk first. She walked him through what she'd found in the communications log. The specific message thread that connected 3 people, Rennick, Ferris, and a logistics coordinator within Pacifica named Grant Ewell. Ewell had been in the military. He'd left the service 4 years ago. He'd worked briefly as a logistics officer during a period that overlapped with the Harlan Valley operation, not in the field, but in a support capacity, close enough to know the names of personnel involved in the after-action report, close enough to recognize hers. The message thread showed that Ewell had flagged her name to Rennick 9 days before the convoy crash. Rennick had passed the flag to Hargrove. Hargrove had initiated the termination. But there was a second thread, a thread between Ewell and a number she hadn't recognized until she ran it against the Federal Contact Directory in the briefing document's appendix. The number belonged to a logistics officer in the active military, currently assigned to convoy route coordination for the Pacific Northwest Regional Command. The convoy that had crashed on Highway 26. She laid it out clearly. The route had been known. The timing had been known. The crash had been coordinated. Not to destroy the evidence was backed up, but to create a scenario in which a mass casualty event would arrive at Harrow Cross while Nora Callahan was in it, or would bring her back if she'd already been removed. Castellan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "What's your assessment of the intent?" "They wanted me in the building in a specific capacity," she said, "not as a nurse managing an emergency. They wanted me associated with the chaos. They wanted my presence to be the story, a terminated employee who came back unauthorized, who inserted herself into a mass casualty response, who made decisions outside her scope." She kept her voice level. "If I'd made any errors today, if any of those patients had died or been harmed while I was running that triage, the story wouldn't have been supply chain fraud. It would have been a rogue nurse with a falsified background causing deaths in a hospital emergency department." Silence on the line. "They were going to use the casualties," Rice said quietly. "They were going to use me," Nora said. "The convoy gave them the scenario. The terminated nurse who walked back in and made things worse would have been the headline. And in the noise of that headline, Ferris and the courier get the drives out through the loading dock, Rennick has time to move assets, and the OIG case loses 3 months of evidence and its most inconvenient witness." Castellan was quiet for a long moment. "You're saying they engineered a situation that depended on you returning to the building?" "Yes." "And if you hadn't returned?" "The crash still happened. The evidence was still at risk. But without me in the building, the supply fraud story plays out more slowly. Weeks, maybe. And the federal team arrives before there's a compelling human error narrative to deflect it." "They built the plan around your psychology," he said. "Around what they thought my psychology was," she said. "They knew I couldn't walk away from a mass casualty event involving military personnel. They were right about that part. They were wrong about what I'd do once I was inside." Another pause. "Grant Ewell," Castellan said. "The active military contact, the convoy route." "That's your case," she said. "Not mine. I'm giving you the thread. What you do with it is your job." "Agreed." His voice had shifted, not warmer exactly, but with a quality of directness that suggested he'd just updated something in his assessment of her. "Ms. Callahan, the position I mentioned last night, the coordinating role, I want to revisit it." "I'm still thinking about it," she said. "Think faster," he said. "What you just did in 40 minutes with a briefing document that my team has been working for 6 months, that's not a small thing." "Your team didn't have the Harlan Valley context," she said. "No," he agreed. "We didn't." She ended the call. D. The active military logistics officer was taken into custody 3 days later. His name was Captain Darian Wells, and he'd been coordinating convoy routes for 18 months and had, the investigation determined, been on Pacifica's payroll for 14 of those 18 months. He'd provided route information to Ewell, who'd provided it to Rennick, who'd had the semi stolen and positioned and staged with a precision that required exactly the kind of insider knowledge Wells had. Grant Ewell was arrested the same day as Wells, at a hotel in Seattle, where he'd been since the night of the crash. Not fleeing, exactly, but not at his registered address either, which was its own kind of statement. He cooperated immediately and extensively, the way people cooperate when they've understood that the architecture they were part of has collapsed and they're standing in the rubble of it. His cooperation produced names. 6 additional individuals across 3 states, all with connections to the Pacifica Distribution Network's diversion scheme. Supply chain managers who'd signed off on falsified delivery records. A billing coordinator who'd processed the fraudulent invoices for 4 years. 2 regional hospital administrators, not at Harrow Cross, but at facilities in the broader network, who had known about the shortage and had been compensated for their silence in ways that had gone into private accounts rather than on any institutional record. The full scope took 11 days to document. Nora was at Harrow Cross for most of those 11 days, working her shifts, doing the job. The department was different now. Not transformed, not fixed, not the version that exists in the story someone tells afterward when they've smoothed all the difficult parts into a clean narrative. It was still a busy emergency department with too many patients and not enough of everything, staffed by human beings who were variously excellent and average and tired and trying. But something had shifted in the ambient atmosphere of the place. A quality of attention, maybe. The specific alertness that comes when people understand that what they observe matters and that saying so has consequences beyond their own career. Bev Okafor's formal statement to the OIG had been filed under whistleblower protection. Legal counsel had confirmed the protection applied retroactively to her February observations. The 2 patients from those February cases were notified. Their cases were reviewed by the independent clinical panel that Nora had requested in the board meeting. One of those cases resulted in a finding of delayed standard of care. Not catastrophic, the patient had recovered fully, but the delay was documented and the patient received a formal acknowledgement and a settlement offer that they had the right to accept or not. Sandra Vale had flagged the administrative hold to the compliance channel and had not been punished for it and had not been thanked for it in any official way, which was how those things often went. Nora found her in the break room on a Thursday afternoon and said, "The hold flag, that mattered." Sandra looked at her coffee cup. "I should have done something months ago." "You did something when it counted," Nora said. "That's not nothing." Sandra looked up. "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" "No," Nora said. "It's supposed to be accurate." Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then she almost smiled, which was something Nora had not previously seen her do. "You're strange," she said. "I've been told," Nora said, and got her coffee and went back to work. The public charging documents were filed in federal court on a Tuesday morning, 14 days after the crash. Marcus Rennick faced 11 counts of wire fraud, 4 counts of healthcare fraud, 2 counts of obstruction of justice, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit evidence tampering. The last charge related to the drive extraction attempt at Harrow Cross. His attorney entered a not guilty plea, and the bail hearing resulted in detention pending trial on the grounds that his network and resources constituted a flight risk. The judge's language in the detention order was specific and unsparing, and the portion of it that addressed the supply chain fraud, the medical dimension, what it had meant in clinical terms for patients who'd waited for equipment that should have been there, was quoted in every news report. Cole Hargrove's charges were filed separately and the same day. 2 counts of healthcare fraud, 1 count of obstruction, and 1 count of conspiracy related to the administrative hold he'd attempted on Nora's incident reports. He'd cooperated extensively with the federal investigation in the weeks leading up to the filing, which his attorney would argue as a mitigating factor. It might matter. It might not. That was for the court to determine, and Nora had made her peace with the fact that she did not control that part. His medical license was suspended by the Oregon Medical Board pending the outcome of the criminal proceedings, which was announced on the same day as the charges and was a separate action entirely, institutional rather than judicial, the medical profession regulating itself through the mechanisms it had, imperfect and slow and real. Jerome Ferris's medical privileges at Harrow Cross had already been suspended. His license review was opened by the medical board 2 days after his arrest and moved at a pace that reflected the seriousness of the evidence. The February documentation tampering was the center of the case against him, not the most dramatic element of the broader fraud, but in some ways the most damaging to who he was professionally, because it showed a doctor using the tools of clinical documentation to conceal harm to patients. The review board's preliminary finding, released to him and his counsel before it became public, concluded that the modifications constituted a fundamental breach of clinical integrity. He lost his license 4 weeks later. The board's findings were public record. Nora read them once, sitting at her kitchen table in the morning before her shift. She didn't feel satisfied, exactly. Satisfaction implied a cleanliness that wasn't there. She felt something more complicated, the specific weight of an outcome that was right, and was also insufficient, the way outcomes often were when the harm that had preceded them couldn't be undone by the consequences that followed. She put the document down and went to work. 3 weeks after the crash, the board of directors held a formal session that they opened to department staff, not to the public, but to the nurses, the doctors, the technicians, the orderlies and coordinators, and the people whose names didn't appear in the news coverage but who had been working in the building when all of it happened. Margaret Ashby spoke first. She was not a person who gave speeches in the political sense. She spoke the way she'd spoken in the conference room, directly and without decoration. And what she said was an accounting rather than a performance. What had gone wrong? What the board had failed to see? What the governance failures had been, and what they were doing to address them? She used the word accountability several times without flinching from it, which was harder than it looked. Nora was in the back of the room. She had not prepared remarks. She had not been asked to speak. She was there because Ashby had asked her to be present, and because the people in this room were the people she worked with, and their presence at this meeting was about them as much as it was about anything else. Ashby spoke for 12 minutes. Then she said, "I want to acknowledge, publicly and on the record, that the events of that day were set in motion by a woman who had been employed here for less than 48 hours, who was terminated before the mass casualty event arrived, and who came back anyway." The room was quiet. She filed 2 incident reports through proper channels before she was terminated. Both were accurate. Both described real problems that were being deliberately concealed. Her presence during the mass casualty response contributed materially to the outcomes of that day. The patients who survived, the evidence that was preserved, the arrests that followed. Ashby paused. And she did this after this institution told her she wasn't wanted here. Nora kept her eyes on the wall above Ashby's head. "I can't undo that," Ashby said. "The board can't undo it. What we can do is make clear that it was wrong, and that the culture that made it possible, the culture that allowed senior staff to dismiss, marginalize, and ultimately remove a qualified clinician because she asked inconvenient questions, is not the culture this hospital will operate under going forward." She looked toward the back of the room. "Nora Callahan has accepted the position of Director of Emergency Operations," Ashby said. "She starts formally next week. Her reporting authority to this board is direct and unconditional, as she requested. Her mandate is to identify and address exactly the kind of safety and integrity failures that this institution allowed to persist for too long." A pause. "We're lucky she came back." Someone in the room started clapping, and then more people, and it built into the kind of sound that filled a space without quite filling it, the sound of people who had been through something difficult acknowledging each other for having gotten through it. Nora stood at the back of the room and let it wash over her, and did not cry, which she had not done once in the past 3 weeks. Not because she wasn't capable of it, but because the 18 years before Portland had built a specific architecture around that particular expression of feeling, and it didn't come easily and it didn't come publicly. She would probably cry later, alone, in her car or her apartment, or some in-between place where the architecture let its guard down. That was fine. That was human. That was what happened when you kept it together for as long as you needed to, and then didn't have to anymore. For now, she stood at the back of the room and nodded, once, to the people in it. Sergeant Dale Morrow called her on a Friday afternoon from whatever base he'd been transferred back to, which she didn't ask the name of, and he didn't offer. "Vega's been cleared for active duty," he said. "She starts reintegration next month." "That's good news," Nora said. "She wanted me to tell you something." His voice had the particular quality of a man delivering someone else's message carefully. She said, and I'm quoting, she was specific about this, she said, "Tell her she's why I didn't quit, after the surgery, when they told me the recovery timeline. Tell her I kept thinking about how she didn't leave." Nora was at her desk in her new office, which was a room she was still getting used to occupying, a room with a window that looked onto the hospital courtyard, which was smaller and quieter than the coffee shop street, and was a different kind of beginning. "Tell her I'm glad she's okay," Nora said. "That's it?" "That's it," she said. "Tell her I hope she has a long career. Tell her the world needs people who stay in it." A brief pause. "Yes, ma'am," Morrow said. After the call, she sat at the desk for a moment. She thought about what she'd said. The world needs people who stay in it. She hadn't planned to say it. It had come out of something she'd been carrying and hadn't fully articulated, the thing underneath the past 3 weeks that had been trying to resolve itself into language. She'd spent 2 years in Boise building a life around the concept of withdrawal. After Harlan Valley, after the after-action report, after the career complications that had followed from telling the truth about what had happened on that hillside, she'd wanted out. Not permanently, not in any dramatic sense. Just out of the machinery of consequence, out of the places where her decisions touched other people's lives directly and immediately. She'd wanted to be smaller, to take up less room, to go to a coffee shop 3 times and have it start to feel like a routine. She understood now that it had never been a realistic plan. Not because she was exceptional. She was careful about that word, careful about the story that built up around people who had done hard things, the story that turned the doing into something larger and cleaner than it actually was. She wasn't exceptional. She was trained and experienced, and she had a specific set of capacities that she'd developed over 18 years at considerable personal cost. And those capacities had a way of being needed in the places she walked into, regardless of whether she'd intended to need them. That was not a burden. She'd been treating it like one for 2 years, and it wasn't. It was just who she was. The question was what she did with it. She picked up the briefing document Castellan had sent for their follow-up meeting, which was scheduled for Monday. The document was 50 pages long and covered 4 additional medical supply networks that the Pacifica investigation had flagged for preliminary review. Different companies, different regions, the same architecture of falsified documentation, and shorted supplies and people in positions of institutional trust, making decisions that prioritized institutional protection over patient welfare. 50 pages. 4 networks. An unknown number of patients across an unknown number of facilities, waiting in emergency rooms for equipment that had been billed and paid for and never arrived. She opened to the first page and started reading. Details. Roland Pruitt was discharged from Harrow Cross 5 weeks after the crash. She ran into him by accident. Her office was on the 2nd floor, his discharge was being processed on the 3rd, and they ended up in the same elevator, which was the kind of coincidence that happened in hospitals because hospitals were buildings where trajectories crossed without planning. He looked better than he had in the operating room, which was not a high bar, but he also looked better than he had when she'd seen him in Bay 6, which was. He was moving carefully, the post-surgical caution of someone who understood what had been repaired and was not interested in testing it. He had a bag over one shoulder and a discharge folder in his other hand and the mild disorientation of a person who had been inside a building for 5 weeks and was about to step back into the world. He looked at her for a moment without recognition. Then it landed. "You're the nurse," he said. "One of them," she said. From when they first brought me in." He was working through it. "The corridor, you came out of Bay 6 and someone was with you, and you said something to them, and then you were gone." She remembered that moment differently. She'd come out of Bay 6 after the resuscitation, pressed her hands against the wall, breathed. He'd been stable. She'd moved on. She hadn't known he was conscious enough to see anything. "You should have gone up to surgery earlier," she said. "That was my error. I flagged you and didn't get back." He stared at her. "I'm alive," he said. "I know. I'm glad you are. I'm also telling you accurately what happened." He was quiet for a moment, processing this response, which was apparently not the one he'd expected. "Okay," he said finally. Is that how you do this?" "Do what?" "This." He gestured vaguely. "All of it." She thought about how to answer that. The elevator reached the ground floor and the doors opened, and she held them with one hand. "I try to see things clearly," she said. "The things I did right and the things I didn't. Both of them. I find it's easier to keep going if you don't lie to yourself about which is which." He stood in the elevator looking at her. "That sounds exhausting." "It is sometimes," she said. "It's also the only way I know how to do it." He nodded slowly. He stepped out of the elevator into the lobby, and she followed, and they walked to the main entrance together in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. At the doors, he stopped. "Thank you," he said, not expansively, just the 2 words, placed carefully, like something he'd been carrying and had found the right moment to set down. "Take care of yourself," she said. He walked out into the Portland morning. She watched him for a moment through the glass doors. He moved carefully, the way people moved when they were new to the outside of something. He reached the sidewalk, stopped, tilted his face toward the sky briefly. Not dramatically, just a second, like checking the weather, like remembering what weather was, and then walked on. She turned around and went back to work. Done. The first month as Director of Emergency Operations was not a triumph. She had not expected it to be. It was meetings and documentation and institutional resistance from the people who had been comfortable with the previous arrangement and were discovering that comfort was no longer the organizing principle. It was conversations with department staff that were awkward because she had occupied 2 contradictory roles in a very short time. The new hire they'd ignored, and then the person who had run the mass casualty response. And neither of those roles mapped cleanly onto the one she occupied now. It was also, occasionally, exactly what she'd needed it to be. A week into the role, a second-year resident named Fowler knocked on her office door and stood in the doorway with the expression of someone who had been building courage for this specific action for a while. "I noticed something," Fowler said. "Come in," she said. He came in and sat down and told her about a pattern he'd observed in the medication administration records for the inpatient units, not the ED, the floors above. A discrepancy in timing between when medications were logged as administered and when the nursing staff's notes indicated the patient was actually assessed. Small, consistent, the kind of thing that might be documentation sloppiness or might be something else. And he'd been looking at it for 2 weeks and hadn't known who to tell, because the previous answer to that question had been, historically, to tell the department chief. And the department chief in this case was one of the physicians who had been interviewed extensively during the federal investigation and whose continued employment was itself under internal review. She listened. She asked 3 clarifying questions. She asked him to send her the specific records he'd flagged through the new secure reporting channel she'd established in her second day in the role. He sent them that afternoon. She reviewed them that evening. She forwarded them to the pharmacy compliance officer with a request for an independent audit, copied to Ashby, noting the source as a protected internal report per the new whistleblower protocol she'd written into the department's operating procedures. The audit found sloppiness, not fraud. That mattered. It also found 2 genuine timing discrepancies that warranted a follow-up review, which happened. And Fowler, 2 weeks later, stopped by her office again. Not with a problem this time, just stopping by, the way people started to do when they understood a door was actually open. "How'd it go?" she asked. "They fixed the protocol," he said, "for the logging timing." "Good," she said. He stood there for a second. "Did you always know things were going to work out?" She looked at him. He was young, and he meant the question sincerely, and underneath it was the thing young people in difficult institutions often needed to know. Whether the effort was worth it, whether the risk of speaking up produced anything real, whether the architecture of accountability that people described in policy documents actually functioned in the physical world. "No," she said honestly. "I didn't always know. I still don't know, most of the time. Things work out or they don't, and you don't control that part." He looked uncertain. "What you control," she said, "is whether you looked, whether you said something, whether you used the tools available and did it anyway." She held his gaze. "You knocked on this door, that worked out. If it hadn't, you would still have been right to knock." He thought about that. "That's kind of a hard way to live," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is. It's also the only way that produces anything real." He left. She turned back to the briefing document on her desk. The Castellan follow-up, the 4 additional networks, the 50 pages of investigation scope that was going to require several more weeks of careful analysis before Monday's meeting. She picked up her pen. Her elbow ached in the splint. 6 weeks, Tran had said, and it had been 4 and it was going to be 6, and that was just the timeline of the thing and not something she could negotiate with. She adjusted her arm and kept working. Outside the window, the hospital courtyard was doing what hospital courtyards did in the late afternoon. A few people sitting on the benches, a maintenance worker crossing diagonally toward the service entrance, a tree that had been there longer than the building around it, bending slightly in a wind she couldn't feel from inside. She thought about the coffee shop 3 blocks from her apartment. She'd been back twice since all of this had started. The person behind the counter had started to recognize her, which was the beginning of what routine looked like. She was going to keep going there. She was going to find the routine she'd come here for, and it was going to exist alongside everything else. The meetings, the 50 pages, the Monday call, the patients, the residents who knocked on doors, the long work of fixing something that had been broken deliberately by people who'd understood the value of what they were breaking. Both things could be true. She'd learned that. Or maybe she'd always known it and had spent 2 years forgetting. The quiet life she'd wanted was not incompatible with the person she was. It just looked different than she'd imagined. It looked like a window with a courtyard view and a pen in her hand and an elbow that hurt and a door that was open. It looked like being, finally, exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because someone had decided that, not because the story required it, but because she'd walked back through the doors when the situation asked her to, and had kept walking forward from there, one decision at a time, without the illusion that any of it would be clean. The people who had dismissed her, who had laughed at the bag and the worn shoes and the plain resume, they had built their entire understanding of her on the things that were visible on the surface, which was a failure of imagination as much as anything else. They had looked at what she appeared to be and stopped there, because stopping there was comfortable, because it kept the existing order intact, because the alternative, seeing clearly, asking questions, adjusting what you believed based on what was actually true, was work that most people avoided when avoidance was available. She had never had that option. Not because she was better, but because she had learned, at some cost, what happened when people stopped looking. She had been in places where the price of not looking was paid in lives, and that education didn't leave you. You carried it, and it was heavy. And it was also the thing that made it impossible to stand in an elevator bay and not notice what was happening on the other side of the doors. The Pacifica case would move through the court system over the following months. The trials would take time. Some of the plea agreements would happen faster. The evidence was substantial, and the cooperation had been extensive, and the federal team was thorough, and Nora understood enough about institutional accountability to know that this would eventually produce specific consequences, not perfect consequences, not consequences that fully addressed the scale of the harm, but real ones, documented and public and on the record. Rennick would be convicted. The evidence was too complete for another outcome. His attorneys would work the timeline, argue the scope, negotiate where negotiation was possible. It would take a year, maybe longer. At the end of it, his company would be dissolved, its assets liquidated. The falsified billing records entered into evidence that would be publicly accessible for anyone who wanted to understand what supply chain fraud looked like from the inside. Hargrove would negotiate a plea. She'd come to understand that about him. He was ultimately a person who optimized for survival, and pleading to lesser charges with cooperation was survival adjacent. He would likely not go to prison or would serve minimal time, and his medical license was gone regardless, and the hospital that had been his professional identity for 15 years now had his name on a federal charging document. That was a specific kind of consequence, the kind that followed a person. Ferris had lost the thing he'd built his life around, which was the license and the identity that came with it. And she thought about that sometimes, not with satisfaction, but with the complicated feeling of someone who understood that people were not simply the worst thing they'd done, and also that the worst thing they'd done had to carry a cost. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and there was no formula for resolving them cleanly. She didn't try. She wrote for another hour, the pen moving across the pages of the Castellan briefing, notes in the margins, questions flagged for Monday. The 4 networks taking shape as a problem she could begin to understand. The sun moved across the courtyard outside. The maintenance worker came back the other direction. The tree bent in the wind again. At 6 o'clock, she capped the pen, put the document in the desk drawer, and picked up her bag. She turned off the office light. She walked out through the department on her way to the exit, the way she always did. Not checking, not inspecting, just present, available. The way you stayed when you understood that being available mattered. Bev was at the nursing station, and they exchanged a nod that carried more than it appeared to, the shorthand of people who had been through something real together and didn't need to perform the relationship. Octavia was coming off a shift and said, "Good night," and Nora said, "Good night." And it was ordinary, and it was enough. She walked out through the main entrance. The Portland evening was cool and clear, the rain from recent weeks having given way to a dry spell that made the city look cleaner than it was. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, not hesitating, just pausing, the way you pause when you're present in a moment rather than moving through it. She thought about what she'd said tomorrow's message, delivered secondhand from Corporal Vega. The world needs people who stay in it. She believed that. She had earned the right to believe it through the specific experience of having stayed, of having walked back through the doors when it would have been easier to keep walking, of having put things on paper that needed to be on paper, even when putting them there made her life harder. She had earned it through the mistakes, too. Pruitt and Bay 6, the 8 minutes, the things she could have done differently and hadn't. Both sides of the ledger. She started walking toward the parking structure. Somewhere behind her, the hospital continued doing what hospitals did. The relentless, imperfect, necessary work of keeping people alive, staffed by human beings who were tired and trying and who now, because of a two-day employee who wouldn't stop asking questions, had a direct line to someone whose door was open and whose job it was to make sure what they saw was taken seriously. That wasn't a perfect system. It was a better one than had existed 3 weeks ago. She would take it. She kept walking into the evening, into the next thing, into the life that had turned out to be different than the one she'd planned, and more demanding and more real. A life built not from the absence of difficulty, but from the decision, made over and over, to meet it directly, to see it clearly, and to stay.